A coward's lie. He told her, "I love someone else," knowing she was pregnant with his child. 2 years later, he saw her again, hand in hand with his identical triplet daughters. The office was silent. Far too silent for a building that commanded a billion-dollar empire. Iris Adams stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city blur beneath her. She could see her reflection in the glass, her soft blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her abdomen. Her sky-blue eyes were filled with a fragile hope. Behind her, Nathan Reed stood like a sculpture of himself, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his dark hair perfectly coiffed, those same piercing blue eyes that once looked at her as if she were his entire world. Now they were cold, distant, as if looking right through her. "I love someone else," he said, the words cutting through the air with brutal precision. His voice was calm, rehearsed, but his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Iris turned slowly, as if the movement itself was painful. She searched his face, desperate for a crack in the mask, a sign that he was lying. To himself. But there was nothing, only a void. "You know I'm pregnant, Nathan?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of those words seemed to pull the walls closer. "I know," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to her stomach, where their unborn child was growing. "That's why it has to be this way." It was surreal. The man who once whispered promises in her ear, who had held her as if she were fragile and sacred, now stood before her like a stranger. Iris's lips parted, but no words came out. What was there to say? Begging was beneath her. Anger would only shatter her. So she just stood there, breathing, fighting the urge to collapse. Her heart screamed, but her face remained still. "I hope she was worth it," Iris said finally, the only defense she had left. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to the end. Nathan didn't follow her. He didn't say a word. The doors closed, sealing off the man she thought she knew. As the elevator descended, Iris placed a hand on her belly, feeling a soft flutter from within. A tear rolled down her cheek, but her chin remained held high. This was no longer about Nathan Reed. This was about survival. About 3 tiny heartbeats she had promised to protect, even if their father had decided to forget them. The city was loud when she stepped outside. It didn't care about broken hearts or betrayals. That day, Iris Adams promised herself she would never look back. Why do you think Nathan chose to lie to Iris instead of telling her the truth, no matter how painful? What would you have done in her situation? The fortress of a mother. The apartment was small, barely enough space for one person, let alone a woman carrying triplets. The walls were thin, the heater groaned in protest every night, and the cracked window let in the bitter wind, no matter how hard she tried to seal it. Iris had lived in luxury before, in penthouses where the floor gleamed and the city lights looked like distant stars at her feet. Now she lived paycheck to paycheck, every dollar stretched until it was almost breaking. She sat at her kitchen table, which was really just an old desk she'd dragged home from a second-hand store. The sewing machine in front of her hummed late into the night, its rhythm the only music in the empty apartment. Scraps of fabric lay scattered on the floor. She had taken up sewing little girls' dresses, custom orders, through an online shop. It didn't pay much, but it was honest work, and it allowed her to stay home, close to her growing belly. Each stitch felt like an act of defiance, as if she were weaving strength into herself with every pass of the needle. The pregnancy was hard, far harder than the doctors had warned her. From the very first sonogram, when the technician's eyes went wide with surprise, and the word triplets was whispered with a mix of awe and concern, Iris knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary journey. She remembered sitting in the sterile white office, listening to the risks laid out in clinical, distant voices. Premature birth, low birth weights, the strain on her heart and body. There was even a moment, a cold suggestion from a specialist, that she could reduce the pregnancy, choose one child to keep, to improve the odds of survival. Iris had walked out of that office without a word, but her silence was her decision. All three of them, or none. The nights were the worst. Sleep was elusive, chased away by discomfort, and the endless loop of thoughts that replayed in her mind. She would lie awake, one hand on her stomach, feeling the soft movements, sometimes a kick, sometimes a flutter that felt like tiny wings brushing against her from the inside. In those quiet hours, when exhaustion and loneliness threatened to swallow her, it was the thought of those three little lives that kept her afloat. They were hers. They were real. She had no family to fall back on. Her mother had passed away years ago, and her father was a distant memory of someone who never cared enough to stay. Friends had slowly faded after the scandal with Nathan. In their world, loyalty shifted with wealth and reputation. Pregnant and alone, she didn't fit into their social calendars. One night, as a cold rain beat against the window, Iris found herself sitting on the floor, surrounded by tiny dresses she had just finished sewing. She gently took a sky blue one, holding it against her belly. She pictured a little girl wearing it, with dark hair, bright blue eyes, laughing as she spun in circles. Then another in pink, another in soft lavender. Her vision blurred with tears, but this time they were not from despair. It was love. A fierce, overwhelming love that burned away every wound Nathan had left. Her body ached more with each passing week. Simple tasks became mountains. There were days when just getting up felt like lifting the weight of the world. But she refused to stop working. Every dollar mattered. Every dress she sewed was food on the table, rent for another week, or a warm blanket for her babies. People admired her designs. They messaged her praising the delicate craftsmanship, but none of them knew the true story. None of them knew that the woman who sewed those dresses often wept over them in the dark of night, whispering promises to the children who had not yet been born. The day she went into labor came earlier than expected. Iris had dreaded it, knowing the risks, knowing how fragile everything was. The contractions began while she was finishing an order, and within hours she was in a hospital bed under the blinding white lights, doctors murmuring in clipped, urgent tones. It was chaos and fear, yet through it all, Iris remained calm. She had made peace with the possibility of loss, but somewhere deep inside, she also believed in miracles. When the cries filled the delivery room, first one, then another, then a third, Iris couldn't hold back the sobs. They were small, heartbreakingly tiny, but alive. Sky, Sophie, Sadie. The nurses briefly placed them against her chest before whisking them away to the neonatal unit. Iris's heart broke and mended in the same breath. The days in the hospital blurred together. She would sit by their incubators, watching their tiny chests rise and fall, tubes and wires attached to their impossibly small bodies. She whispered stories to them, told them how brave they were, how proud she was of every small breath they took. The doctors were astonished at how strong the girls were. Against all odds, they were fighters, just like their mother. When she was finally allowed to take them home, Iris stood at the door of her apartment, holding the car seats with trembling hands. The space looked even smaller now, but it didn't matter. She placed them gently in a row, staring at the three faces that mirrored their father's features, yet belonged completely to her. "I'll protect you," she whispered, even if it costs me my life." And in that small apartment, surrounded by worn-out furniture and the soft coos of her daughters, Iris Adams became the strongest woman in the world. What do you think gave Iris the strength to keep fighting, even when the odds were against her? Was it pure love for her children or something else? The unseen echoes. The city was alive that afternoon, bathed in the soft light of early spring. The streets bustled with people, the chatter of conversations blending with the distant hum of traffic. Nathan Reed walked along the crowded sidewalk, his hands in his coat pockets, his head bowed, as if the weight of his thoughts had grown too heavy to bear. His life, once pristine, had unraveled thread by thread in the last 2 years. Boardrooms no longer greeted him with the same reverence. His last name had become a point of quiet scandal, whispered in the glass hallways. But that wasn't what haunted him. It was her face, Iris's face. He had seen her in his dreams, her voice echoing in the empty spaces of his penthouse. He would wake up to silence, sometimes half convinced the curve of her smile had only been imagined. But each time it was real, more real than anything he had left. He didn't know why he took that route today. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some invisible thread was pulling him, drawing him toward the collision course he had been avoiding. As he turned the corner into the park, the world seemed to stand still. There, in the middle of the trees just beginning to show their first green buds, a woman stood by a bench, adjusting the straps on a stroller. Her hair caught the light, a soft halo of blonde that stole his breath. His steps faltered, slowing until he stopped completely. The city faded into a blur around him. Iris. But it wasn't just her. The stroller wasn't for a single child. There were 3 small seats, and in them sat 3 tiny little girls, identical in their perfection. Dark hair peeked out from under pastel hats, and when one of them turned her head, Nathan saw it. The same penetrating shade of blue that greeted him every morning in the mirror. For a moment he couldn't move. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a deafening drum. It was surreal, like watching his own life unfold in front of him from the outside. They were real, flesh and blood. His daughters. Iris noticed him then. Their eyes met across the distance, and Nathan felt the sharp sting of her gaze. There was no hatred in her expression, no drama, no accusing gesture. What he saw was worse. She looked at him as if he were nobody, a stranger, a passerby, as if every memory they had shared was buried under the rubble of his betrayal. She bent down, unhurriedly, lifting one of the girls into her arms, cradling her close while she adjusted the other 2 in the stroller. It was an act of simple motherhood, but to Nathan it was like watching an entire lifetime he had lost. He could see the small gestures, the way Iris's fingers gently brushed the child's cheek, the softness in her eyes, which had once been reserved for him. He took a step forward, then another. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he had made a mistake? Those words felt grotesque, empty, unworthy of the woman standing before him, who had raised 3 daughters in a world that had turned its back on her. Iris's expression remained calm, but her grip on the child in her arms tightened slightly. She was protecting them, not out of fear, but out of instinct. She was a mother now, and Nathan realized in that moment that he no longer had any tie to her or to them. Still, his body moved of its own accord, driven by the desperate ache inside him. "Iris," he said, but his voice was hoarse, barely audible against the noise of the park. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her back to him, adjusting the stroller straps with a methodical precision. One of the girls let out a soft giggle, oblivious to the storm brewing in the air. Nathan felt the distance stretch between them, wider than the few steps that separated their bodies. He stood frozen, watching as Iris pushed the stroller forward, her pace steady, unhurried, as if he had never existed. He followed her, though he kept his distance. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a punishment. Maybe it was hope. He watched them as they moved through the park, Iris stopping occasionally to fix a dropped toy or to kiss a small forehead. The girls babbling in a language only they understood. Every movement was a small miracle, a world he had never been invited into. But Nathan could see it now, clearer than ever. He hadn't just lost Iris. He had lost 2 years. First words, first steps, the quiet moments of wonder that belonged to a child's early life. He had been absent, not because he was kept away, but because he had chosen to walk out of that hospital room 2 years ago, too scared of the fallout. When Iris reached the park gate, she stopped. For a fleeting second, Nathan thought she might turn around, that maybe some part of their shared past would flicker in her expression. But she didn't. She adjusted the sun hat on one of the girls, whispered something that made her laugh, and walked out onto the busy street. Nathan stood there long after they were gone, the wind tugging at his coat, the sounds of the city washing over him like a distant echo. His heart wasn't just broken anymore. It was empty, hollowed out by the sight of 3 little girls who didn't even know his name. But as he stood there, staring at the space where they had been, a quiet resolve began to take shape. This wasn't over. Not for him. He had lost 2 years. He wouldn't lose a lifetime. He turned and began to walk, not back to his office, not back to his penthouse, but toward the only future that mattered, a future where he would have to fight, not for his reputation, not for his fortune, but for the right to stand beside the woman he once loved, and the daughters who had no idea their father had just seen them for the very first time. The battle for forgiveness had just begun. What do you think Nathan's first step should be to win back a chance with Iris and the girls? The unpaved road to redemption. The address hadn't changed. Nathan found it scribbled in a notebook that had somehow survived the chaos of his life. An address he had never dared to use until now. It was a modest building tucked between a laundromat and a corner store, a world away from the sleek glass towers and private elevators he was used to. He stood outside the door, staring at the worn brass numbers, as if they were an ancient code he had to decipher. His hand hovered over the bell, the weight of everything he had lost pressing against his chest. When he finally pressed it, the sound echoed, sharp and invasive, breaking the fragile air around him. Minutes passed. He wasn't sure if she would answer. He wouldn't have blamed her if she hadn't. But then the door opened. And there she was. Iris stood in the doorway, makeup free, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, dressed in simple jeans and a soft sweater that clung to her in a way more beautiful than any designer dress. She looked at him with the same quiet indifference he had seen in the park. But now, up close, he could see the quiet exhaustion in her eyes, the shadows of sleepless nights, the weight of a woman who had carried too much for too long. Nathan opened his mouth to speak, but Iris's hand went up slightly, stopping him before a single word could escape. "What do you want, Nathan?" Her voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was factual, as if she was asking him to state his purpose and leave. "I need to see them," he said, his voice raw, barely holding together. "I need to see my daughters." For a moment she didn't move. The silence between them was thick, as if the walls had drawn in closer. Finally, Iris sighed, not in defeat, but in resignation, as if she had known this moment would come eventually. She stepped aside, wordlessly allowing him into the apartment. The inside was exactly what he had feared, and yet more than he could have ever imagined. It was small, yes, but it was warm. Toys were scattered across the floor, handmade dresses hung neatly on a line, and tiny shoes were lined up by the door. It wasn't a place of wealth, but it was rich with life, with care, with love. The air smelled faintly of lavender and baby powder, a scent that hit him harder than any confrontation could have. "They're asleep," Iris said, crossing her arms over her chest as she leaned against the door to what he presumed was their shared room. "They nap after lunch. You have 10 minutes, Nathan." He wasn't sure if she meant 10 minutes to talk or 10 minutes to prove his worth, but either way, he accepted it. He stepped into the living room, careful not to disturb the delicate order of the chaos. He noticed a small photo on the shelf, Iris holding the 3 girls in her arms, her smile soft and tired, but genuine. He had never seen her look more alive, and it shattered him. "I didn't come here to beg for forgiveness," he began, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to understand something. That day, when I said I loved someone else, it was a lie. A coward's lie. My family, my board, they held a gun to my head, Iris. They told me if I didn't walk away from you, I would lose everything. And I didn't have the courage to fight them. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I disappeared, at least they wouldn't drag you into their war." Iris didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She stood still, absorbing his words with the same calm she had used from the moment he arrived. He continued, the words spilling out of him now, the dam finally broken. "I didn't know about the triplets until after you were gone. I came back to the office, and they told me you had quit, disappeared. I tried to find you. God, I tried, but my father made sure every door was closed. They wanted me to marry someone from their circle, to tie me to their business empire. And He paused, swallowing the bitter taste of his own failure. "I let them win. I let fear dictate my choices. But after that day, I couldn't live with myself. I broke ties. I sold my shares. I'm not the CEO anymore, Iris. I'm not the man who chose power over you. I'm just a man who's been walking around empty for 2 years." There was a long, suffocating pause. Iris's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition in her expression. But then her arms crossed tighter, as if she needed to brace herself. "You think saying that changes anything?" she asked, her voice quiet, but carrying an edge. "You think because you finally woke up, I'm supposed to give you back the life you walked away from? Do you have any idea what it's like, Nathan? To carry 3 lives inside you while the father of those children vanishes into thin air? To sew dresses at 3 in the morning because it's the only time you have left, after changing diapers and rocking crying babies to sleep? You left. You don't get to come back and pretend a monologue fixes that." Nathan felt the sting of every word. She was right. Of course she was right. But this wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about fighting for the chance to be worthy of being in the same room as the pieces. "I don't expect forgiveness, Iris," he said, taking a step closer, though not close enough to invade the fragile boundaries she had set. "But I'm not going to vanish again. I'll be here, even if it's just as a shadow in their lives. I'll earn my place not because I want to, but because they deserve a father who never gives up." A soft sound interrupted them. It was faint, but unmistakable. The drowsy murmur of a child waking from a nap. Iris's head turned slightly toward the bedroom door, instinct overriding her posture. For the first time since he had arrived, Nathan saw her armor crack. The mother in her was always on alert, always ready. She looked at him again, her expression unreadable now. "You're not coming near them until I decide you're safe," she said, her voice clipped, but not unkind. "Not safe for me. Safe for them." Nathan nodded. It was more than he had hoped for. He wasn't looking for a shortcut back into their lives. He was ready to take the long road, however brutal it was. As Iris disappeared into the bedroom to tend to the girls, Nathan stood alone in the small living room, his heart beating with something new. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was a beginning, a first breath in a life he had almost destroyed. He turned to the small window, the city stretching out beyond the glass. For the first time in a long time, the world didn't look so empty. Do you think Iris is right to be so cautious with Nathan? What does Nathan's willingness to be a shadow in their lives say about his new character? The unspoken language of trust. The days after his visit passed slowly, as if time itself had thickened around Nathan, forcing him to wade through each moment with the weight of his choices pressing in on him. Iris didn't call. She didn't text. But she hadn't slammed the door in his face either. That was more than he deserved, and he knew it. Yet the thought of his daughters growing up without knowing him was unbearable. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future, even if it meant starting at the very bottom of their lives. Nathan began showing up at the park, where Iris took the girls on their morning walks. At first he kept his distance, sitting on a bench under a tree, pretending to read a newspaper while his eyes were fixed on them. He watched as Iris gently lifted each girl onto the swings, her hands careful, but practiced, as if she could do it in her sleep. The girls, Sky, Sophie, and Sadie, were small whirlwinds of curiosity, their dark giggles bouncing as they meandered with the chaotic coordination of toddlers learning their world. He memorized every sound of their laughter, every tilt of their heads, and every moment Iris's hand reached out instinctively to guide or protect them. At first, Iris ignored his presence. She would look over at him, offer no recognition, and turn all her attention back to the girls. But he noticed she never left the park as long as he was there. She was allowing him to stay in view, as if she were silently testing him to see if his resolve would wither. One morning, when the spring air was soft and the park was less crowded, one of the girls, Sophie, he would later learn, wandered over to his bench. Her small legs moved with a determination only a 2-year-old could possess. She stood in front of him, staring up with big blue eyes that mirrored his own. Nathan froze, fearful that the slightest wrong move would shatter this fragile moment. He offered a hesitant smile, lowering the newspaper into his lap, his hands open and non-threatening. Sophie tilted her head, studying him with innocent curiosity. Iris was there in seconds, kneeling beside her daughter, her expression unreadable. She didn't scold the child, didn't pull her away. Instead, she just looked at Nathan, her gaze sharp, measuring. Without a word, she scooped Sophie into her arms and carried her back to the stroller. But something had shifted. She hadn't built a wall between them. Not this time. The next day, Nathan came prepared. He carried a small paper bag with fresh fruit slices, the kind that small children loved. He didn't approach them directly. Instead, when Iris sat on a bench to read while the girls played within her reach, Nathan quietly placed the bag on the end of the bench and walked away. Iris noticed. At first she didn't touch it, but when one of the girls began to fuss, she reached into the bag, pulled out an apple slice, and offered it to her daughter. She never looked at Nathan, but he saw that her fingers trembled slightly. These small, wordless interactions became their language. Nathan never intruded, never crossed the invisible line Iris had drawn. He would sit nearby, sometimes reading, sometimes watching in silence, and offer small gestures. A missing toy he'd noticed, a small blanket when the wind picked up. Slowly, Iris's posture began to soften. One afternoon, a wheel on the stroller got stuck as Iris tried to maneuver it over a patch of uneven pavement. Nathan was at her side before she could even look up, kneeling to fix the wheel with a quiet efficiency that surprised even himself. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But when the wheel was back in place, Iris exhaled, a silent, involuntary sigh that held more weight than words. For the first time, she didn't immediately retreat after accepting his help. The girls, too, began to recognize him. They would point in his direction, babbling incoherent phrases, their faces lighting up with smiles when they saw him approach from a distance. He never allowed himself the luxury of lifting them into his arms or kneeling at their level without Iris's silent approval. But each glance, each small smile from the girls was a battle won. The weeks turned into months. Nathan became a part of their routine, not as a father, not yet, but as a constant presence. He learned their favorite songs, the rhythm of their afternoon moods, the way Sophie would scowl when she was concentrating, how Sadie always claimed the left side of the stroller, and how Skye would reach out a hand for balance whenever she wandered onto uneven ground. He also learned Iris's silences, how to read the subtle shifts in her posture, when to hang back, and when to offer a quiet act of assistance. One rainy afternoon, the park was almost empty. Iris was struggling with an umbrella while trying to shelter the girls as she adjusted the stubborn stroller cover. Nathan walked over without being asked. This time, she didn't stop him. He held the umbrella steady over her as she secured the cover, their hands brushing just once, but the touch sent a quiet jolt through him. When Iris was done, she looked at him, and for the first time her eyes softened, not with resignation, but with a tired gratitude. "You're persistent," she said. Her tone was neutral, but there was no coldness in it. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to him since that day at the apartment. "I can't afford not to be," Nathan replied, his voice steady, though his heart hammered with the importance of her words. The girls giggled under the stroller cover, oblivious to the delicate truce forming above them. Iris's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from one either. Nathan didn't need to win her over with grand gestures or empty apologies. It was the small things, the daily patient acts of just being there. Every cutthroat business instinct he once prided himself on had no place here. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation. This was a slow, relentless climb, step by step, back into the life of a woman who had every reason to shut him out. And yet, she was letting him in, inch by inch. How does Nathan's consistent, small actions change the dynamic between him and Iris? Do you think his persistence is enough to earn forgiveness? The public uprising. The morning paper arrived earlier than usual. Nathan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the front page where his own face stared back at him under the headline, "Blake Eyre Rebuilds Empire in the Shadows." It was a scathing article, full of half-truths and veiled threats, crafted by the very people who once applauded his rise. His former business partners, the board members who had pressured him to sacrifice Iris, now painted him as a liability, a man who had turned his back on his family's legacy for a woman beneath their circle. The article didn't mention Iris or the girls directly, but the innuendos were clear. They had found out he was spending time with them again, and they wanted it to stop. The phone call came later that afternoon. He recognized the number immediately. Jonathan Pierce, one of the board members who had once acted as a second father to him, now spoke with the cold precision of a man delivering an ultimatum. "Nathan, we need to discuss these appearances you've been making in public parks. The company's image is not something we can allow you to tarnish any further. You need to decide what matters more, a woman and her children, or the empire your father built." Nathan had heard these words before, dressed in different tones, laced with softer threats. But this time, they didn't shake him. This time, the image of Iris lifting Sadie in her arms after a tumble, of Sophie's contagious laughter, of Skye's tiny hand reaching out for his, was clearer in his mind than any boardroom chart or stock price. I already made that decision 2 years ago, Nathan replied, his voice quiet, though every word was laced with steel. And I chose wrong. I won't make that mistake again. He hung up before Jonathan could respond, but he knew this was just the beginning. The threats would escalate. His former allies had too much pride, too much invested in their image to let his defiance go unanswered. And this time, they wouldn't settle for veiled articles and whispered warnings. They would go after Iris, not directly, but through the ruthless whispers that could ruin reputations, destroy her small business, and paint her as a scandalous opportunist. He couldn't let that happen. Nathan arrived at Iris's apartment late that night, unannounced. He didn't expect a warm welcome, but she let him in without a word. The girls were asleep, their small breaths filling the tiny room with a peaceful rhythm that stood in sharp contrast to the storm brewing outside. "They're going to come after you," Nathan said, as soon as the door closed behind him. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't offer the courtesy of softening the truth. "The people I used to work with, they've found out about the girls, about you. They're going to twist the story. They'll try to make it look like you trapped me, as if you're the reason I left the company. This isn't about me anymore, Iris. It's about you. They'll want to destroy your name to save theirs." Iris's face remained unreadable, but her eyes blazed with a familiar fire, the same protective ferocity that had kept her daughters safe every day of their lives. She didn't ask why Nathan was only warning her now. She didn't need to. She knew how power worked, but she had never been one to bow her head, even when the odds were stacked against her. "I'm not afraid of them," Iris said, her tone steady, though her arms were crossed over her chest as if bracing for battle. "I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of being the woman people whisper about, but never ask the truth of. If they want a story, I'll give them one." Nathan hadn't anticipated her defiance, though in hindsight, he should have. She had always been stronger than him when it came to weathering storms. The next day, Iris made a decision that surprised even Nathan. She reached out to a journalist, not one of the vultures who thrived on gossip columns and corporate hit pieces, but a woman named Grace Adams, known for her courageous reporting on corruption and her sharp sense of justice. Grace was reluctant at first. These stories often ended with the victim's voice buried under corporate PR machines. But as Iris laid out the truth, the pregnancy, the silence, the forced exile from Nathan's world, Grace realized this wasn't just another scandal. This was a fight against the very structure that silenced women and protected the elite. The interview took place in Iris's apartment, with the girls napping in the next room. Nathan was there, but he remained silent, sitting in the corner, watching Iris tell her story. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. She spoke with a quiet dignity, explaining how she had built a life from nothing while protecting her daughters from a world that considered them inconvenient truths. Grace listened, took notes, asked the hard questions, and promised to print every word uncensored. When the article ran, it wasn't in the gossip pages, but on the front page of a major news outlet. One woman's fight against an empire, the story of Iris Adams, became a headline that caught fire within hours. The response was immediate. People rallied behind her. Mothers shared their own stories of corporate abandonment and betrayal. Women who had been silenced found in Iris a symbol of defiance. The internet exploded with support, while the corporate board scrambled to control a narrative that had slipped from their hands. Nathan watched as Iris handled the storm with grace, never stepping out of line, never stooping to their level. He attended meetings where investors demanded accountability, but this time, the tide had turned. The company couldn't afford to be seen as the villain. The Blake name had been tarnished not by Iris's existence, but by the callousness of those who tried to erase her. A week after the article ran, Nathan stood beside Iris as they walked through the park, the girls babbling excitedly in their stroller. People recognized her now. Strangers offered kind words. A mother stopped to thank her for speaking up. An older man gave a respectful nod as they passed. Iris had become something more than a name in an article. She was a symbol of quiet rebellion, a reminder that power didn't belong exclusively to those in boardrooms. Nathan saw the change in her, how she stood taller, how her laughter came more easily. He had feared his world would destroy her, but she had done what he had never dared to do. She had faced it head-on and come out stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the park, Iris stopped, turning to Nathan with a look that was softer than it had been in months. "You said you wanted to fight for them," she said, nodding toward the girls. "You'll have your chance, Nathan, but this time, you'll do it on my terms." He nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into his bones. There was no room for pride here. There was no shortcut to redemption. But standing beside her now, in the middle of a world that had tried and failed to silence her, Nathan understood that this battle was far from over. But for the first time, they were no longer fighting it alone. How does Iris's public choice to tell her story change the dynamic of her battle against Nathan's family? What does it mean for Nathan that he's now fighting on her terms? The beginning of forever. The city had changed, or maybe it was Nathan who had. The streets looked the same, but now every corner held a memory of the life he had almost lost. The imposing offices that once symbolized power now seemed small compared to the quiet strength of Iris's world. Her story had ignited something much bigger than either of them could have predicted. What began as a single article had spread through social media, news networks, and public forums. People no longer whispered about Iris Adams behind closed doors. They shouted her name with pride. She had become a symbol of resilience, not because she sought fame, but because she had stood her ground when it would have been easier to disappear. Nathan spent his days balancing between helping Iris in small, almost invisible ways, and facing the backlash from his old world. The investors who once treated him like a golden boy now looked at him with a mix of confusion and reluctant admiration. They couldn't deny that the company's stock had stabilized, even gone up slightly, since Iris's story broke. It wasn't just sympathy, it was trust. People wanted to believe in something real again. They were tired of polished statements and corporate smiles. Iris's raw honesty had given them something authentic to root for. But Nathan knew that public opinion was fickle. It could change with a single misstep. That was why he walked carefully. Every public appearance with Iris and the girls was deliberate, though never staged. They would go to the park, visit small cafes, always living their lives just as they had before, but now under the watchful eye of a curious public. He didn't mind the attention, not when he saw the way people approached Iris, not with invasive questions or pity, but with a quiet gratitude. Mothers would stop and smile, fathers would nod respectfully, and sometimes women who had been through their own private wars would share a few words of solidarity. Iris never reveled in the attention, but Nathan could see how much it meant to her. For once, she was not invisible. The girls were growing fast. Skye had become the leader of the trio, always the first to explore, the first to defy. Sophie, quieter, more observant, her eyes always scanning, taking in the details. Sadie was the peacemaker, the one who would reach out when her sisters clashed over toys or attention. Watching them grow, watching their personalities unfold, was a daily reminder for Nathan of everything he had almost missed. Every moment, every small milestone, felt like a victory. One afternoon, after a long day filled with interviews and meetings, Nathan found himself back at Iris's apartment. It had become a ritual these evenings. He would arrive after the girls were tucked into bed, and they would sit in the small living room, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in a comfortable silence. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, not of conflict, but of something unsaid that hung between them. Iris sat cross-legged on the sofa, her fingers tracing patterns absently on the fabric. Nathan sat opposite her, his elbows on his knees, leaning slightly forward, as if the distance between them needed to be physically closed. She looked tired, but not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep. It was a deep weariness, the kind that settles in when you've been fighting for too long. "I've been thinking," Iris began, her voice steady but softer than usual, "about what comes next, about what all of this means now that the world knows." Nathan listened, sensing this wasn't just a casual reflection. "I don't want them to grow up in a story that's defined by what we've lost," she continued. "I want them to know who they are, where they came from, but not to be trapped by the mistakes we've made. They deserve more than that. And I think maybe we do too." Nathan felt his throat tighten. He had rehearsed so many apologies, so many declarations of love in his mind, but none of them felt worthy in this moment. Instead, he just nodded, waiting, letting her set the pace. "I see the way they look at you now," Iris said, her lips curling into a faint smile. Not with caution, but with a kind of quiet confidence. "They trust you. They trust that you'll show up. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "That's all I want to be," Nathan said quietly. "Someone who shows up. For them. For you." There was a long pause. Iris's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there, a vulnerability she rarely let him see. "I've built so many walls, Nathan. I don't know how to tear them down without losing myself." He leaned back slightly, giving her space, but his words carried a quiet intensity. "Then don't tear them down. Let me climb over them. Let me earn every single brick." Her laugh was soft, almost reluctant, but it was the most beautiful sound he had heard all day. For the first time, it felt as if the distance between them wasn't so insurmountable. The next week, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. It was a simple afternoon at the park. The girls were playing near a sandbox, Nathan sitting on the grass a few feet away, Iris watching from the bench. A young female journalist approached, this time without a camera crew, no microphone, just a notebook and a nervous smile. She wasn't there for a scandal or a scoop. She was writing an article about fathers who struggle to come back into their children's lives. She asked if Nathan would be willing to share his story, not the polished version, but the real one. Nathan looked to Iris, silently seeking her permission. She gave him a small nod, her eyes reflecting an understanding that this was no longer just their private battle. It had become something bigger, a narrative that could reshape how the world viewed redemption, fatherhood, and second chances. The article ran under the headline, "The Father Who Refused to Disappear." It wasn't sensational. It spoke of his failures, of his cowardice, but also of his persistence, of his silent acts of showing up every day for the daughters who had no reason to trust him. The public response was overwhelming, but this time it wasn't filled with scandal-seeking whispers. It was filled with letters from fathers, from children, from people who yearned for reconciliation but never found the way. Nathan realized then that the past didn't need to define them, not if they were willing to rewrite the ending. And Iris, who had fought so fiercely to protect her daughters from the world's callousness, was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the rubble. One afternoon, as they were packing up after a day at the park, Sky reached out, grasping Nathan's hand, without being prompted. She looked up at him, her blue eyes large and trusting, and simply said, "Ari." The word was soft, almost a whisper, but it echoed louder than any applause Nathan had ever received in his life. He turned to Iris, his heart in his throat, but she was already looking at him, her lips curved in a smile that was no longer guarded. In that moment, Nathan understood that forgiveness wasn't a grand gesture. It was in the quiet moments, in the way a 2-year-old's hand could bridge a 2-year silence, in the way Iris no longer looked through him, but at him. He didn't need her to say the words. He could see it in her eyes. The walls hadn't disappeared, but now there was a door, and for the first time she was standing there, holding it open. The air was warm with the promise of summer, and the city felt softer that afternoon, as if even its sharp edges had been blunted by the quiet anticipation that hummed beneath the surface. Nathan had planned every detail meticulously, not in the grand, over-orchestrated way he might have once, but with a care born of humility. He knew that Iris didn't care for lavish displays or empty gestures. She valued sincerity, and he intended to give her nothing less. The park had always been their place. It was there he first dared to follow her, where his daughters unknowingly offered him their acceptance, in the form of simple smiles and outstretched hands. It was only fitting that it would become the setting for what Nathan hoped would be the beginning of their next chapter. He arrived early, setting up a quiet picnic under the large oak tree that had shaded them on so many afternoons. There were no photographers hiding in the bushes, no elaborate decorations, just a soft blanket, a basket filled with Iris's favorite foods, and a small box tucked safely into his pocket. The girls were in on the secret, as much as 2-year-olds could be. He had spent the night before with them, crafting 3 small golden heart pendants, each engraved with their names: Sky, Sophie, Sadie. They had giggled as he explained their special mission, though he wasn't entirely sure how much of it they understood. But it didn't matter. Their presence was enough. When Iris arrived, pushing the stroller with a practiced grace, she looked at him with a mix of curiosity and cautious amusement. The girls were restless, squirming in their seats, eager to be free. Nathan stood up and walked over to them, his heart hammering with a nervousness that had nothing to do with a fear of rejection, but with the importance of the moment. "This looks dangerously like a date, Nathan," Iris said, her lips curving into a smile that was no longer laced with skepticism. "Maybe it is," he replied, lifting Sophie out of the stroller and settling her on the blanket. "But it's not the kind you're thinking of." Iris raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as she began to unpack the basket with him. The girls tumbled onto the grass, their laughter filling the air, oblivious to the tension that was slowly building in Nathan's chest. He waited, letting the afternoon unfold with ease, not rushing, not forcing the moment. They ate, they talked, and for a while it felt like any other afternoon they had shared. But beneath his calm exterior, Nathan's fingers were toying with the small box in his pocket, the words he had rehearsed over and over again swirling in his mind. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the park in shades of gold and amber, Nathan knew it was time. He reached into the basket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. The girls, sensing that something was happening, gathered around him with wide, expectant eyes. He handed each of them the pendants, their tiny fingers grasping the delicate chains with excitement. "Girls," he began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I need your help. Do you think you can give these to Mommy for me?" Sky, always the leader, nodded with a serious expression, as if she understood the gravity of her task. Sophie followed suit, her lips curved in a shy smile, while Sadie, ever the peacemaker, clapped her hands in approval. Together, they toddled toward Iris, who watched them with a perplexed expression, Her eyes narrowed as they presented her with the pendants. She took them, her fingers brushing the engraved names, her lips parting slightly in surprise. Nathan stood up, his heart pounding against his ribs, and crossed the space between them. He knelt in front of her, not out of tradition, but because it felt right. Because Iris Adams had carried more weight in the last 2 years than he had ever known, and she deserved more than a man standing over her with a question. "I know this isn't the life you imagined," he said. His voice was raw and exposed, "and I know I'm not the man I was supposed to be. But every day with you and the girls, I've learned what it means to show up, not with promises or grand gestures, but with a quiet persistence. I don't want to be a visitor in this life we've built together, Iris. I want to be the home." He reached into his pocket and retrieved the box, opening it to reveal a simple ring. No extravagant diamonds, no ostentatious display, just a band, crafted with care, with a phrase inscribed inside that only she would understand. The 3. Always. Iris's breath hitched. She looked at him, at the ring, at her daughters who were now sitting and watching, mimicking their father by kneeling in the grass, giggling at their own private joke. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming truth that this man before her had changed. Not for the world, but for them. Nathan didn't pressure her. He let the silence hang, understanding that Iris's answer would never be given lightly. But then, as if the walls she had so carefully built had silently crumbled, without either of them even realizing it, she smiled. It was a smile that carried every battle scar, every sleepless night, every whispered promise she had made to her daughters in the dark. And in that moment, Nathan knew her answer, even before she spoke. "Yes," Iris said softly, reaching out to take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, as naturally as if they had always been meant to. "Not for the ring, for you, for them, because we've already built the life that matters." The girls shrieked with joy, oblivious to the magnitude of what had just happened. But their laughter was the perfect soundtrack for the moment. Nathan slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of what it symbolized. Iris leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his, and for the first time they allowed themselves to simply breathe in the same space, with none of the ghosts of their past standing between them. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a soft twilight, Nathan realized something profound. Proposals weren't about perfection or spectacle. They were about timing, about showing up, about understanding that love was forged in the quiet moments of shared struggle. And on that afternoon, surrounded by the sounds of his daughter's laughter, Nathan Reed knew he had found everything he had been searching for, not in boardrooms or business deals, but in the small, beautiful world that Iris had created against all odds. They sat together on the blanket, Iris's head resting on his shoulder, the girls nestled between them, and for the first time in years, Nathan felt what it was to be complete. The past was still there, but it no longer defined them. The future was uncertain, but it no longer terrified him. And the present, in all its imperfect, chaotic beauty, was exactly where he belonged. The meaning of a second chance, the story of Iris and Nathan, is a powerful exploration of how love, family, and redemption are earned, not given. Iris's journey is a testament to the quiet strength of motherhood. She didn't need a hero. She became one for her children, building a life from nothing and protecting them from the world that cast her out. Her strength is what ultimately forces Nathan to confront his own failures. Nathan's redemption isn't about him getting a second chance at a relationship. It's about him earning the right to be a father. He had to shed his old identity, his arrogance, and the values of his family to understand what truly mattered. His consistent, patient presence in the girls' lives, his quiet support of Iris, and his final act of a humble, heartfelt proposal all prove that he is a changed man. The ring, with its simple inscription, "The Three Always," is not just a promise to Iris, but a recognition of the family she built without him. It's an acceptance of his new reality and his place in it. The ending is a beautiful subversion of the traditional fairy tale. There's no dramatic rescue, no lavish wedding announcement. The true happy ending is in the messy, human reality of their new life. They are a family, not because of a ring or a grand gesture, but because they have chosen to be. They have built their home on a foundation of honesty, respect, and a shared commitment to a future that is entirely their own. The greatest power they possess is not wealth or influence, but the love and trust they fought so hard to create. Their story reminds us that some of the most profound victories are the ones we achieve not for the world, but for the people we hold closest to our hearts.